Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the second lecture this year in our annual Victor Obenhaus Lecture Series. I'll give a brief introduction and then we'll hear Rebecca Blackburn's lecture. After the lecture, there will be some time for questions and discussion. As I noted in our last Obenhaus lecture, Victor Obenhaus was a professor of Christian ethics at CTS for nearly 30 years in the mid-20th century, and he even served as the interim CTS president for 1 year in 1973 to 74. The Obenhaus lectures are a long-standing tradition at CTS and provide our PhD students with a formal setting in which they can present their work. Each fall, PhD students are asked to submit abstracts, and then the faculty of the PhD committee selects 2 students to present. So those that are giving lectures each year have been chosen from among other submissions for their particular topics and their potential to engage the student scholarship. I'm excited to welcome Rebecca Blackburn today. Becca began her studies in the PhD program at CTS in 2020 and is currently in the pre-candidacy phase of her program. She came to us first from Michigan, where she graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's in social work and summa cum laude with a master's in spiritual formation and leadership from Spring Arbor University. After college, she went to Fresno, California, where she worked at Fresno Pacific University in residential life as a residential director, and then to Spokane, Washington, where she served at Whitworth University as the Associate Director of Student Services just before joining us in our PhD program. She's been a teaching assistant for several CTS courses and has also worked with our faculty in various ways, such as providing research assistance to Professor Morales and helping Professor Mikva create a discussion guide for her latest book. I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Blackburn today and to hear her give her paper entitled Un-Sutured Reading, a Critical Task for White Christian Biblical Interpretation.
Thank you so much. I'll share my screen here briefly. All right. Thank you, Dr. Vogt, for that lovely introduction. And I also want to thank you and the PhD committee for this opportunity to present in the Victor Obenhaus Lecture Series. It's already been an incredible learning opportunity. Thank you to my advisor, Dr. Rachel Mikva, for bearing with me in all things and for all your support in each of my endeavors. To my friends, my family, and colleagues who have gathered or who will watch this later, it means so much to have you here. Thank you. And Ramadan Mubarak to those who are journeying through this holy time. To my partners in crime, Lena Safi and Jonathan Blackburn, thank you for your listening ears on the many iterations of this project. If there are mistakes or omissions, they are my own, but I credit much of the viability of this endeavor to the quality feedback I received from Lena and John. And finally, to everyone, if you did not have the privilege of being present last week for Reverend Jamie Fluker's open house lecture, I encourage you to watch that recording online because she gifted us with an inspiring and deeply thoughtful lecture. It was entitled Faith on the Front Lines, Womanist Theology, Public Activism, and Fannie Lou Hamer, and it is well worth your time. My own lecture today has undergone a title change, but as Dr. Vogt said, I am presenting Unsutured Reading, a Critical Task for White Christian Biblical Interpretation. When I was young, let's come over here. There. When I was young, I was an avid reader of the Bible. I pored over its words to find a message to me from God for that day. I believed that the text was not just relevant for me, but that in effect it was about me. A good reading only had to inspire me to actions I could fulfill and manage on my own because my personal faith experience was the reason I was reading. This hermeneutic also helped me engage more difficult text. For example, when the crucifixion narratives disturbed me with their violence, I responded by practicing guilt about what my sin put Jesus through. In that way, I metabolized difficult text into something that I could control, into something that brought alignment between my life and the text. As I grew older, I gained more tools and perspectives for Bible reading. I learned the importance of reflecting on how our social location participates in our interpretation. And I'm thinking here of Dr. Crowder and the wonderful things we learned in hermeneutics. So in many ways, I have to credit this kind of learning to scholarship from womanist, queer, feminist, and other marginalized perspectives. However, as many in the field of biblical studies have noted, it's a problem when only marginalized voices are treated as contextual or as reading from their social location. Dominating or privileged readings are also contextual. And so in this project, I started with the question, what does it mean for me to practice critical reflective awareness of my white Christian reading of the Bible? Biblical studies scholar Mary Ann Tolbert explains, quote, our privileged locations in the hegemonic system seem right, normal, and unproblematic. Hence, they tend to remain unmarked and generally unnoticed. Underscoring this exact tendency, Wongi Park, also a biblical studies scholar, notes, quote, that while the discourse around race and ethnicity in biblical studies has grown exponentially in recent years, there is a curious lack of attention to whiteness, unquote. This presentation is a small effort to help address this lack, bringing together the work of critical whiteness studies with biblical hermeneutics. I analyze how the social location of a white Christian might participate in biblical interpretation, and I posit that linearity acts as a normative lens within this social location. My methodology follows a constructive conversation between two texts. The first is Catherine Keller's esteemed hermeneutical and theological work, Face of the Deep, A Theology of Becoming, published in 2003. Uncovering the watery deep of Genesis 1-2, she explores what it means theologically to become if we are created not out of nothing, but out of the primordial abyss. My second text is George Yancey's stirring introduction to his edited volume, White Self-Criticality Beyond Anti-Racism, How Does It Feel to Be a White Problem, published in 2015. Here, Yancey invokes W.E.B. Du Bois's question, how does it feel to be a problem? Which Du Bois had directed to people of color, to people who experienced racism. And in this edited volume, Yancey redirects that question to white people, inviting them to reflect on whiteness being the problem of racism. In my readings of Keller and Yancey, I show how they critique assumptions of linearity in both Christian theology and white social ontology. Then how they aid the construction of a hermeneutic of disclosure. I borrow Yancey's language to call this unsutured reading. I will then deploy each of these hermeneutics, linearity and unsutured reading, in a consideration of John chapter 19, verses 23 through 37. I'm very excited to hear your questions and provocations and comments after this presentation. So for now, let's jump in. An initial reflection on linearity in the context of a white Christian imagination connotes a series of movements in sequential, logical order that add up to progress, freedom, or salvation. To attain order, linearity forecloses alterity and promotes singularity and closure. Linearity draws a clean line through time, controlling a multitude of decisions about relationships and interpretations. In mainstream Christianity, the orientation toward linearity connects directly to an apocalyptic eschaton with God's cosmic triumph over evil. Last year, I had the privilege of taking Dr. Rashad's class on white Christian hegemony in the United States, where I encountered some of these ideas in the work of Paul Kivel. Kivel writes, quote, in this linear temporal system, one returns to the past condition of paradise through the future coming again of Jesus and the judgment. The focus of attention on an Edenic and pure past state, nostalgia, and the aspiration to achieve such a state again in the future, hope, promotes a view of the world we live in as a place in which people are wayfaring strangers traveling through a land of temptation and corruption, unquote. So while it's not inevitable, this linear conception of cosmic time can foster an impatience, a distrust, or a submersion of the present. And if Kivel sees the Christian linear temporal system beginning with Eden, Keller pushes back even further and sees this system beginning with interpretations of creation. First, she highlights the link between the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, and the maintenance of a linear worldview. In the logic of this doctrine of creation out of nothing, for God to be omnipotent, God had to be unprecedented. But Genesis attests to deep waters well before it attests to the words, "Let there be." Keller remarks, quote, the Christian theology that early came to dominate the church could not tolerate this constraint upon God's power. For why should he have had to reckon with an other? The prevenient chaos cramped the growing Christian imaginary of mastery, what we may call its dominology, its logos of lordship, unquote. And so the emphasis on mastery and omnipotence overwrites the chaotic alterity stemming from the deep. These reflections don't just represent theological abstractions, though. Rather, this theology is incarnated into a range of social practices and relational paradigms. And I can illustrate this with a story from my high school years. I was lucky to have a very good group of bus friends. Here we all are together on the last day of school with our amazing driver, Miss D. We all ran in different social circles in school, and we held vastly different worldviews, but on the bus, we were a solid clique. One day, it came up in conversation that because I was a Christian, I wouldn't marry or date someone who wasn't also a Christian. My friend Kyle, he's the third from the right, Kyle was a staunch and friendly atheist, and he was flabbergasted by this logic. He tried to wrap his mind around this kind of relational exclusivism. I tried various ways of explaining, eventually getting to the place where I said, why would I spend my life with someone I couldn't spend eternity with? So even at this young age, my linear theology significantly shaped how I conducted my relationships. My pursuit of primary relationships had to be channeled into the through line of my salvation. And so I had to actively assess who I thought would make it to heaven. This perspective naturally begins to evaluate or judge others based on their perceived alignment to or alterity to my linear trajectory. Beginning with exclusivity, this kind of linear worldview can and has led to the rejection of otherness. Beginning with control, it can and it has led to oppression. This kind of linear thinking is not just present in Christian theology, but also in white social ontology. Yancey points to the process by which this linearity is enacted. Quote, suturing, from Latin sutura, meaning a seam or sewing together, is the process whereby whites install forms of closure, forms of protection from counter-white axiological and embodied iterations, epistemic fissure, and white normative disruption, unquote. Suturing shuts out the influence of alterity and supports the narrative of white control and self-governance. Suturing is easily detected in white supremacy and white fragility, but it also animates the construction of the white enlightened self. We might recognize this linear narrative. It's an Amazing Grace kind of story. I once was lost and ignorant about race, but now I've seen the light and I'm an ally. In this narrative, inevitable mistakes and failures get erased or projected on others because the idea of linear progress presses so strongly on the imagination. The narrative of the good white person is one of closure, and sitting with the indeterminacy of failure or of uncertainty in our relationships with others, it threatens that closure. Some years ago, I was hosting a group of friends in my home when I made an ignorant comment about the relationship between free speech and hate speech. One friend, a woman of color, expressed her discomfort with what I had said. So first, I tried to defend my intentions and prove I was open-minded. And later, when I had reflected and thought I was ready to take responsibility for my words, I texted her a sincere apology. When I never received a response, I experienced what I might call a white emotional tantrum. In the silence between our phones was an indeterminacy that threatened to uncoil my understanding of myself as a good white person. I eventually sutured myself against that indeterminacy by deciding that the ball was out of my court and there was nothing else I could do. My inability to hover over this gaping moment of relational disclosure was a direct product of a linear expectation of white self-mastery and white racial goodness. Yancey explains this is because the problem of whiteness is bigger than just the white self. It is an entire system of white racist relational processes in which the white self is embedded. And so with all of this in mind, I don't think it's a surprise that for many white Christians, a hermeneutic of linearity marks our engagement with the Bible. So as we turn to considering the crucifixion narrative in John's gospel, I want to consciously apply this lens of linearity, which I think is often unconsciously applied by white Christian Bible readers, and I want to see what emerges. Because I've chosen a pretty long passage, for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize it instead of read it. But if you would like to find it for yourself, we're looking at John 19:23 through 37. So in this passage, while Jesus is being crucified, the soldiers divide up his clothing among themselves and also cast lots for a particularly nice seamless tunic. The gospel writer says that this activity fulfilled a scripture. From the cross, Jesus sees his mother and his beloved disciple and gives them to each other as mother and son. The text says that these two stay in relationship from then on. Next, Jesus fulfills scripture, again as the writer contends, by asserting that he is thirsty. He is given sour wine and then he gives up his spirit. When the soldiers come to accelerate the deaths of the crucified, they find Jesus already dead. They therefore have no need to break his legs as they did the other crucified men. Instead, one of them pierces Jesus's side with a spear, and blood and water pour out. The gospel writer notes that these events also fulfill scriptures and that the testimony of the piercing is true, given so that the audience might believe. So I first suggest that a hermeneutic of linearity places a high premium on fulfillment. 4 times in this passage, the writer signifies that something was done to fulfill scripture. The gaping trauma of crucifixion is carefully sutured by assurances that this was supposed to happen. Scriptural references, now converted into prophecies, provide the power of predictive precedence. And so for many white Christians, reading John's crucifixion narrative is an exercise in looking to the past and to the future. The future of resurrection fulfills and supersedes the past of prophecy. This easy linearity can also support an all too common Christian supersession of Judaism. In this move, the New Testament fulfills and exceeds Jewish scriptures. Jewish scripture becomes our Old Testament, and its primary function is now to foresee and affirm Jesus as the Christ. I contend that linearity foments supersession when such Christological readings become the only readings, suturing against the alterity of other serious interpretations of other sincere interpreting communities. Walter Brueggemann reminds us that Christological readings are an imaginative appropriation of the text. That's not a negative label, but rather it's one that should allow us to recognize other imaginative appropriations as, quote, equally legitimate and appropriate, unquote. My second suggestion is that reading John's crucifixion narrative with linearity laces the present of suffering with purpose. Jesus's pain is submerged and it's unprotested. To sit with pain wholly in the present, I think would trouble the clarity which the past and the future bring to this traumatic event. I suggest that for white Christians, a hermeneutic of linearity might actually reinforce our discomfort with pain, our fragility in the face of others' protested suffering, and our reaching for closure when we are uncomfortable. Unexplained or protested pain is, after all, a form of alterity that questions the line of the status quo. And so I argue that learning to read in the present of this text, hovering over the uncertainty of pain, requires constructive alternatives to linearity. Toward that end, Keller offers a theology of creatio ex profundis, a creation from the deep. The implications of this kind of reading are manifold, and they are beautifully presented in her book. But for this project, we will center her work on the emergence of creation in volatile and vulnerable interdependencies. So let's unpack this. Genesis 1:2 reads, "The earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters." In Keller's text, the deep is chaos, a limitless matrix of potentialities. Creations, instead of being logosed out of nothing, co-emerge from the deep as if lured or attracted into self-organizing systems. Keller imagines the divine as the attractor, which lures creation into indeterminate, sensitive interdependence. Creations respond to the lure, and those oscillations between creaturely response and divine reception produce the viable and relational tension in which we make our home. Creation, Keller says, takes place as invitation and cooperation. The extreme sensitivity between creations, the ability to respond freely, namely out of indeterminacy instead of predeterminacy, produces the ethical situation of being. We are always confronted and implicated by the faces of others. These theological recognitions bring us concretely to an examination of white and Christian privilege. Barbara Applebaum, a scholar of race and education, reminds us that privilege is relational and connected to systems of power. The experience of privilege is dependent on the systemic abjection of others. When Yancey asks, "How does it feel to be a white problem?" he underscores that this is a relational question. It implicates Black bodies and bodies of color that suffer under the weight of the reality that whiteness is a problem. The answer to this problem is not a fix, but it's a commitment to a lifetime of undoing, to repeatedly troubling one's embeddedness in the systems which create one's privileges. Yancey calls this process, quote, "being unsutured," which is a powerful process of being uncovered, open, and having the capacity, even if it waxes and wanes, to avoid narrative closure, denial, and evasion, unquote. Yancey's language of unsutured helps us illuminate a hermeneutic alternative for white Christian readings of the Bible. When I was young, the difficulty of the crucifixion narrative led me to make it about me. I could perform my guilt and therefore experience an effective Bible reading. But now I am trying to problematize an easy linearity, which allows white Christian readers to respond to the text in isolated, self-controlled ways. I'm urging us to bring our questions about being unsutured, which are deeply relational questions, and to see how the text illuminates something larger than just us. To unsuture this text, I propose we snip the stitches which hold the narrative on the line between prophecy and resurrection. These are the moments in the text where the writer tells his audience that something was done to fulfill Scripture. What happens when we unsuture these moments? The first narrative stitch is the distribution of clothes. Quote, "This was to fulfill what Scripture says. They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots," unquote. Underneath this stitch is a person who has been declothed, who is naked, exposed, and without a protective layer. We find here a metaphor of exposure. Yancey writes, quote, "I know many whites who do not make space for the question, how does it feel to be a white problem? Figuratively, there is a continuous process of encrustation, a scabbing over. This scabbing over can be theorized as the various ploys that whites use, consciously or unconsciously, to cover over the profound pain and distress caused from being palpably exposed," unquote. An unsutured reading prompts a disclosure of the ways we resist exposure, the ways we resist seeing ourselves as part of the systemic problem of whiteness, or of a religious tradition that so often denigrates the truths of others. The second stitch in the narrative is the drink. Quote, after this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, I am thirsty, unquote. Underneath this stitch is a person who thirsts, who cannot supply their own needs, who depends in some measure on the other. Thirst is the metaphor of vulnerability. Yancey writes, there is a sense of deep anguish in the process of unsuturing. It is also a chance to be touched and addressed through alterity. An unsutured reading begs a consideration of the methods we use to evade vulnerability. It calls us toward vulnerability that emerges in relationships across difference. And I find it compelling that in our text, Jesus' thirst comes just after he gives his beloved disciple and his mother to each other. I read here a connection between vulnerability and belonging. When our sense of exposure and vulnerability drives us to isolation, we suture ourselves against our thirst, against the volatile and vulnerable interdependence through which and for which we are created. But when our vulnerability opens us to be touched by alterity, we can reimagine together what family, what belonging, and what taking care of each other looks like. The third stitch in the narrative is the spear. Quote, and again, another passage of scripture says, they will look on the one whom they have pierced, unquote. The spear yields the metaphor of an open wound. This piercing exceeds its purpose in the crucifixion because that open wound is also part of the resurrected body of Jesus later in John's narrative. The open wound remains. Yancey writes, quote, being unsutured is not just to remain open to be wounded, but it is also to cultivate the practice of remaining with the opened wound itself, of tarrying with the pain, unquote. An unsutured reading brings us to the presentness of pain, to a patience with our own discomfort and lack of narrative closure, to a humility and sensitivity regarding the protested pain of others. Keller tells us that justice is love under conditions of conflict. And here we examine what it means for white Christians to participate in that justice, even as we grapple with our complicity in the conflict. For white Christians to explore the ethics of being unsutured, we must begin by recognizing our efforts as always already incomplete, always already imperfect, and always already embedded in relational systems. From there, I think white Christians can build a practice of critical reflection on how linearity might structure our worldview. And then we can learn through listening about how a linear or sutured approach to the world destructively unfolds in our vulnerable and volatile interdependencies with others. But it doesn't, and it cannot, just stop at reflection and learning. To practice an ethic of being unsutured is to practice the exposure of our evasive tendencies and of our bent toward narrative closure. It is to humbly allow difference to make us vulnerable, to be teachable. And it is to commit to the lifelong work of troubling the systems in which our privileges are embedded. I thank you for your attention, and I'm eager to hear your questions and reflections.
Thank you so much, Becca. That was fantastic and really thought-provoking and interesting. I'm going to open it up to any comments or questions. You're free to unmute yourself and just ask it into the space, or you could put your hand up, or you could write a comment in the chat as well. And maybe as we wait for some folks to gather their thoughts, I might ask you, Becca, how the work you've done for this paper today relates to your dissertation work in general or your larger scholarly objectives?
Sure. I still feel very early in my program. The dissertation proposal has yet to be constructed, but my area is in biblical hermeneutics, which is to understand those foundational assumptions, narratives, and methods that undergird the way that we interpret. And so it's not only understanding different hermeneutical orientations, but trying to bring that critical approach to the hermeneutical orientations of more centered, historically centered or privileged identities and social locations. So, and this is definitely a puzzle piece toward that end.
So my question, since you started with a story of your youth, and in thinking about those communities, the one you came from and the ones that bear some similarities, can you think out loud with us a little bit about how your own journey might translate in speaking to those communities?
Yeah, that's a great question, a great prompt. I think because I still feel a large sense of belonging to many of those communities. Most of the people I know in my life are white Christians in the United States context. And I have deep love and respect for these communities. And so I think my hope is that because I have been privileged enough to experience learning from difference in my educational programs and in my work environments, that if I can bring that back to a place where I belong and say, here's something different, that it can be received in dialogue and that it can begin opening up possibilities and conversation.
Thanks.
Have you presented any of these ideas in a context maybe that might feel threatened by what you're talking about, or had any kind of pushback?
And no, this is the first time presenting these ideas. So if there's pushback, it's going to be happening right here, right now. And I do want to say, I look forward to pushback on this. Linearity is a theme that I have identified and tried to put a name to and tried to think through. And there are several other that I still have kind of early stages of reflection on. But just because I am a white Christian from white Christian communities doesn't mean that my experience is universal either. So, and I also hold space for the fact that linearity can do some good. It can provide some protection, especially for young people who are kind of finding their footing in the world. It's not always, fatefully negative, but in a pluralistic society and in a multiracial society, I have seen linearity be the kind of precondition for violent and oppressive behaviors, whether we recognize that connection or not. And so this is really my early attempts to try to start tracing these things to kind of find, I don't know, the genetic code of some of the more overt beliefs and behaviors that are negative.
Becca, this is Ken Stone.
Hi, Dr. Stone.
Thank you for that. I enjoyed that. I have a question that I hope I can formulate well. And of course, first of all, I come from a very similar, predominantly white, very Bible oriented background. So the sort of premises that led you to where you are, I think I can relate to a great deal. When we think about it in relation to scripture, I automatically think more about the Genesis piece and Catherine Keller's wonderful reading of it than I do about the John story, with which I'm embarrassed to say as a Christian, I don't have much familiarity. So, so I'm going to ask, I hear the point about linearity. I'm thinking about the other side of linearity in terms of the Genesis narrative, Keller's reading of it, the readings on which she relies, not all of which are Christian, like John Levinson and so forth, and the role of chaos there. And I'm wondering, and I mean this in general, but also specifically about race when we're talking with other white Christians, about the ways in which these dynamics play out in racial conflict and so forth. I wonder how we move from getting people to see, critically the danger of linearity to we actually do have to deal directly with chaos. I mean, I feel like you were getting at that at the end when you talked about conflict and so forth. I wonder if you could say a little more, because it's kind of odd to go to people and say, although I support it, but it's kind of odd to go to people and say, I'm going to show you how to feel more chaotic in your reading of the Bible and direct you to resources for feeling less settled, more unsutured, less grounded. And speaking as a teacher, that might actually be one of my goals. But it's difficult to say that up front, right? Because you want to keep your audience with you. So as a teacher yourself, both in academic and religious settings, I wonder how you imagine yourself dealing with that part of the problem. Getting people to learn to live with the conflict, not just recognize the danger in the linearity that's trying to cover over the conflict.
That's a wonderful question. I think, again, depending on the particular context that this would try to be brought to, it would differ a little. So, and part of my inspiration for this is thinking about some of our students here at CTS, some white Christian students who are learning to read the Bible differently and trying to think about how do we encourage some criticality around how this social location influences? Because I see a lot of joy and excitement about marginalized hermeneutics that are new to these white Christian readers, and we love that. I also want to see some of that critical reflection on how Bible reading is shaped by this social location. And so in that context, I think there's actually maybe more openness towards like, sure, unsettle me, let's go for it. In other contexts, my background in spiritual formation has felt like a bit of a bridge. And so drawing from diverse areas of the Christian tradition to think about spiritual practices that put us in the pathway of grace. And the apophatic tradition, I think, is a wonderful way to do that. To center this idea of unknowing and uncertainty as a crucial part of the spiritual religious experience, and to say that this is very much grounded in our tradition, I think has some generative force. And Keller uses some of this in one of her later chapters. So I think in an earlier iteration, I was toying with the link between linearity and certainty, and the need to be clear and the need to be certain about what we believe and what we think. And how that can play out in both racialized and religiously oppressive ways. Keller talks about the doctrine of learned ignorance, or the doctrine of unknowing, as a positive pathway towards entering into conversations where we can be more uncertain and have that more ethical embrace of the other, as Levinus talks about. So that might be one of the pathways to draw on in talking to a white Christian community, is to begin by doing some more foundational work around the apophatic tradition within Christianity.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you want pushback, here's one little piece. The linearity of the eschaton in the white Christian community, you're not going to be able to unsettle that with a spear, some thirst, right? I mean, I realize this was only one little refraction of taking the method and looking at scripture through that lens. But can you think, what are some texts or ideas or things that you were imagining would be next steps that might be big enough to unsettle that deeply grounded eschatological linearity?
Oh, goodness. Well, I appreciate that you think that I have deeply considered next steps, because I was grasping by my fingernails to get to this step. So the vote of confidence is kind. No, I mean, I agree with you. This is not at all a full pedagogical platform. And so it's not a text, but another theme that I think is worth playing with is around redundancy and efficiency. So I think there is some efficiency to the idea of there being a heaven and hell, and the people who check this box go to heaven, and the people who do not go to hell. And that is still a very linear function as well. To think about redundancy as part of the fabric of being theologically, a theological and anthropology of redundancy, that the divine is more likely to be repetitive than a human, that the divine is more likely to say to the sun, do it again, it's a new morning, come back. This is a G.K. Chesterton idea, but that ability to be redundant and to play in the space of dialogue, these are really important concepts that critique not only a linear idea of the eschaton, but really a capitalist interpretation of Christianity that is focused on efficiency. This isn't a deeply thought out response to your question, but these are some of the ideas that I continue, kind of an arsenal of options to do the first step of kind of removing the veil of not being self-critical, not seeing what our norms and assumptions are, to try to pinpoint what some of those major norms and assumptions drive us, and then to start engaging with alternatives. It's not going to unsettle anybody the first time, but hopefully through a paradigm of relationship across difference, these ideas can begin to sink in. I know that's what worked for me. It took time.
I think that your answer also is in part pointing at something that I think is very valuable in the process, which is to illuminate how the line itself was constructed, right? It is not inevitable. It is not divinely, bestowed. It was constructed and contested, right? So, the way you spoke about apophatic thought is a similar kind of it helps us also to see how alternatives, how cataphatic thought and other kinds of ways of approaching faith are constructed by looking at the alterity, right?
Yeah. And I think, I was just at a conference where I was speaking with a younger attendee who just hadn't considered the idea that the Bible may not agree with itself on everything. And this is such a de facto thing for me at this point, but to come back again to that idea that the Bible is multivocal, that there are many different perspectives on the relationship between a creation and an eschaton, and to try to draw those out into starker relief, again, to foster that dialogue and that unsettling, that uncertainty. I think those can be important starting places.
Thanks.
Hi, Becca, it's Rachel. I have so many thoughts, and this may not be very linear, what I'm about to share, but I just wanted to share that I really appreciate this conversation, and I think it's really important, specifically with white Christian religious leaders, to perpetually return to the not knowing space and the chaos and the creative possibility that comes from chaos. I used KELLER in my constructive paper, and your lecture also brought to mind the work of Shelley Rambo. We studied you know already, maybe.
I'm familiar with the name.
Yeah, reading that, her theology of remaining, and that living in the Holy Saturday time was like, I read that my last semester in my MDiv studies. I was like, where has this been all my life, in the Christian church? And saying to Dr. Moon, where has this been all my life? Because this is so much of where life is lived, I think, when we hold a mirror up. And I really appreciate your scholarship being applied in a practical way to this is how this looks in my life. And the questions that have come up, some that Rabbi Mikva asked about, what does this look like then, returning to those white Christian religious spaces, and what kind of newness can come from inviting these, I don't know, answers, and what's the importance, as we talk about at CTS, and I know this is perhaps old now, out of date, but leaders for the next, what strength is possible in leaders who, again, consistently engage chaos as a part of the conversation. And also, closing thought is just the graffiti art at Promontory Point keeps coming to mind. At the very tip of the point, it says linear time is a lie.
Oh.
That graffiti art here in Hyde Park. So that came to mind as well when you
I might have to pilgrimage over there this afternoon to see that.
But thanks so much for this space and all that you shared.
Thanks, Rachel. And your comments are also helping me think about Dr. Stone's question a little bit differently too. And that engagement with chaos. When we're talking about race and religion, another starting point is to think about how the idea of chaos is a racialized one. And we can easily go back and find documents and narratives that try to construct people of color and Black bodies as chaotic. And this is true for women as well. Like, women have leaky, chaotic bodies, therefore they're less useful. And so engaging chaos is really the first step to, critically examining how chaos has been constructed within the bodies of others being outside of the hegemonic norm, is really key to helping us get to that place where we recognize that our survival is predicated on all of us surviving. Our survival is predicated on all of us thriving. And so we have to engage the so-called chaos and the real chaos if there's going to be anything that survives anyway. I was speaking to someone this morning. We were talking about the survival of churches that are in decline. And he said, we really are recognizing that interfaith engagement and dialogue is the key to churches surviving now. And so the more that we pull in to closing off to alterity, the more fragile and brittle and less likely to survive institutions and people become. And the more open and interdependent, and the more we enter into those volatile and vulnerable interdependencies, it's paradoxical, but we become much more resilient and able to face all the things that are happening.
Any other questions or even just general comments for Rebecca?
This is just a general comment. I'm thinking about what you just said, Becca, in relation to Jamie Fluker's presentation last week, and the ways in which someone like Fannie Lou Hamer became, at a certain moment in history, both an inspiration for some people, but also concurrently a symbol of chaos for others, right? And so white racists, for example, within a structural racism and so forth, and the way Fannie Lou Hamer's image was scattered over TV or politically and so forth, it just strikes me as a really good example of how certain bodies are associated with chaos in the context of racism
Mhm.
and gender in that case.
Mhm. Thank you. I've appreciated all the questions and comments. Y'all are helping me stay on my toes and keep thinking critically about the what's next and the what abouts. And that's what this is for. So I really appreciate that.
Well, we could put our hands together one more time, either really or as a little emoji in the corner, and say thank you so much for such an interesting and thought-provoking lecture. That was really wonderful. I'm so glad you came today and shared this with us. And thanks to everyone in the space for being here today. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.